My name is Mirjana Tomić, and I curate seminars and talks on politics and media in Europe for Presseclub Concordia and Forum Jornalismo som Medien. And today it is a special honor, privilege, and pleasure, although I don't know how optimistic it is going to be, to greet our speaker, Evgeny Morozov.
It's all downhill from here. We have to warn them.
What?
It's all downhill from here after the performance.
No, it's going to be very uphill, but I don't know if it will be an optimistic uphill. Evgeny is an internationally renowned writer, researcher, and public intellectual, originally from Salogorsk in Belarus, although from the article in New Left Review, I understand your parents were Russian, who has been studying political and social implications of technology and currently explores what a post-neoliberal progressive project should look like. He's the author of several award-winning books about technology and politics. Evgeny always questions the mainstream thinking. He became famous, if I can say that, with his book, The Net Delusion, The Dark Side of Internet Freedom, published in 2011 when you were 25. Then he wrote another important book. It is called To Save Everything, Click Here, The Folly of Technological Solutionism, 2013, Freedom as a Service, The New Digital Feudalism and the Future of the City. This is about smart cities. And in 2026, Morozov will publish his new work, and I hope he tells us about it. His writings have appeared in numerous international newspapers, magazines. He was a fellow of the most prestigious US universities. He now lives in Calabria, from the US universities to Calabria. He was in 2018 declared as one of the 28 most influential Europeans. He studied at the American University in Bulgaria and obtained his PhD at Harvard University. He's the producer and the host of the podcast, The Santiago Boys and The Sense of Rebellion, as well as the founder and the publisher of The Syllabus, a knowledge discovery platform. Today, we shall talk about big tech and politics, but not only, because Evgeny sees usually 10 years in front of us, and I, as a former journalist, see what is happening today. I'm sure you will have different questions for Evgeny. I will only have 2 or 3 questions because his work and his thinking and his article address technology and politics from very different angles. Let me start connecting your expertise with current political events. Wars in Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, Iran, to name a few. Can current wars be led without the Silicon Valley giants, whose market capitalizations has exceeded the GDP of large economies such as Germany and Japan? Military and intelligence apparatus cannot do without big tech. And I'm quoting an article published in The Syllabus, your newsletter. The letter control tools, among them cloud systems or artificial intelligence algorithms aimed at image and sound recognition, behavior prediction, and military targeting, are essential for surveilling adversaries and allies, and, if needed, to anticipate the moves of at the battlefield. In Ukraine, in the war in Ukraine, most of the American big techs are involved in one aspect of the war. My first question, again, is, are wars now privatized and big tech dominates the wars in collusion with the governments?
Thank you, first of all, for hosting me and for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be back in Vienna. Well, I love beating up big tech as much as anyone, but I also tend to caution, I guess, against taking a somewhat exceptionalist view of both the sector and the digital revolution, if you will, in general. So to give a very specific answer to a question, to some extent, wars have always been privatized, and there have been private armies and mercenaries and economic interests driving conflict. We all know that from theories of imperialism, including liberal and Marxist ones. There is nothing new under the sun in that sense. There are definitely conflicts and friction between different factions, if you will, of capital or of the tech apparatus, if you will. And we do know that there is a lot of money to be appropriated in institutions like the Pentagon, and the older generation of military contractors like Boeing, Raytheon, and others have definitely had their lunch stolen from them by a lot of new and emerging startups. Some of them we know, like Starlink. Some are a little bit less well-known, like Anduril. Some are kind of in between, like Palantir. All of them have technologies that have somewhat unproven status. Again, it varies. Starlink, by and large, is functional and delivers high-speed internet from satellites, which has huge implications for battlefield. Many others, like technology that Anduril now is selling, not just for warfare, by the way, but also for controlling the border, which is also a huge driver of militarization and securitization. Many of them are unproven. They rely on big claims about the ability of AI to identify targets, to operate drones, and to do many other kind of things. Would I prefer all of these activities to rest in the hands of Boeing or Raytheon? Probably not. So the question here, I think, should not really be about to what extent Silicon Valley is stealing the lunch of the traditional defense contractors, but to what extent we need those technologies in the first place. And as an unfortunate consequence of the wars that Europe and the Middle East have been going through in the past few years, we are actually likely to see and already seeing a huge reorientation of the tech economy and digital economy in Europe towards defense needs. And it's celebrated as a positive factor, which I think we should be a little bit critical about that. So celebration of defense tech can definitely have its upsides in very tactical, for very tactical reasons when it comes to drones, for example. But at the same time, I'm not particularly happy that so much of public money and taxpayers' money is going towards what are essentially defense companies masquerading as AI and technology startups. In most other circumstances, we would be much more critical about that transfer that we are now, because the language around what these companies do, and has been my long-running critique, has become extremely euphemistic. We talk about innovation and disruption, while in fact what they're doing is something else and can be analyzed in political and economic terms without needing to tap into this business-like vocabulary of disruption and innovation.
Why do you think there is not enough criticism? Because they also control the platforms that control public opinion? Or because politics needs them? Who needs who more? Tech companies need politics, or politics needs tech companies?
I think it's a very difficult question to disentangle. Ultimately, there is clearly some influence that their shaping and ownership of the public debate has on how we perceive them. Obviously, we have seen people like Jeff Bezos move not just into new media, but actually into buying old media like the Washington Post. We have seen Elon Musk and others seeking to control Twitter, which has now been rebranded X. All of that is not to be dismissed, but I think the roots of our confusion and the lack of scrutiny and the lack of critical thinking really has to do with the way in which technology has been sidelined in most political analysis, and it's very hard to perceive it as an extension of various political and economic projects. It's very hard to see it as an extension of processes like financialization, if you will, where everything suddenly starts revolving around the interest and imperatives of finance. But if data that we are generating in itself becomes an asset class that is tradable, obviously that is the right perspective. But again, since there is a meta-narrative of some kind telling us this is all for the better, it's all towards building new forms of AI that will cure cancer and we shouldn't worry about it, there is the low-hanging fruit response is always to kind of assume that this is just something good because it's part of progress and it's part of science and it's not part of a bunch of venture capitalists armed with spreadsheets trying to understand how they're going to recoup all of these billions that they have invested into the development of AI, which sooner or later, by the way, will be a huge problem, in part because if you look at how much money is being spent by just the top 5 or 6 players, we're talking about something like 50, 60, sometimes $80 billion a year by every one of them. And it's spent to essentially replicate the same set of functions that all of them have. So it's 5 or 6 companies developing the exact same features of facial recognition, voice recognition, image recognition, and so on. And at this point, you start wondering whether the political economic model that we have settled upon for driving this kind of innovation is correct. Because I can tell you that if you start treating it as a public good, AI would require 1/5 of the money that currently is spent on it by private players without necessarily forcing us into the kind of straitjackets that we will be forced into once the time comes to monetize these tools.
When do you think this time will come?
Well, when they run out of cash or the investors who lend the money, which are increasingly sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf states and some weird players like SoftBank in Japan, which is heavily indebted, hit the wall and find other uses for their cash, or the price of oil or gas drops and the government of Qatar or the government of United Arab Emirates is no longer willing to tolerate a decade of losses because there is ultimately no profit anywhere on the horizon. OpenAI itself does not project to actually become a profitable company until 2030 at the earliest, and that's their own projections, and it might take much longer. And the question is whether that moment will come or whether we will end up with a lot of cash being burned, a lot of energy and environmental costs being imposed upon us, only to realize that there have been so many better ways to essentially capture what is a valuable technology, but tie it to a very different funding model, as we have done with many other technologies and social institutions, including, of course, in places like Vienna, which did a wonderful job with housing.
But I would still like to understand why there is this decoupling between technology and politics. It seems to me, I have said it several times, that your podcast, The Santiago Boys, was an eye-opener for me. It is about the coup d'etat in Chile that I remember. I remember the day it happened, and in 1973. And we studied it at my university in the US from all angles, but no one ever thought of technology and how Santiago Allende tried to create sovereign technology for his country and did manage. So we are not going to talk about Chile right now, but how come that political analysis often sideline technology? What is your explanation?
Well, I mean, the answer is probably not that complicated, in that if you really want to have a political conversation about technology, it has to be linked to economics, and it has to be linked to questions of development, it has to be linked to questions of trade, and it has to be linked to questions of dependence. And in the case of Latin America of 1960s, 1970s, all of those conditions were met, because those were countries that had a choice between leaving their dependence on foreign goods, industrial goods that could help them industrialize but on dependent terms, or developing their own industries that would allow them to essentially go up the ladder in the development process, if you will, and do what so-called Asian tigers, including China, did in the 1990s and 2000s. Of course, that was the key difference between South Korea and Taiwan, and to some extent Japan, is that in Latin America, those were political movements and governments that were very much on the left, and where labor and organized labor still had quite a bit of say in shaping the course of industrial development, so that it wasn't just the interests of domestic capitalists and financiers that were favored. Transposing that paradigm to Europe is somewhat difficult, because to some extent, it's difficult and also not difficult, because if you look at who has been driving the debate on technology in Europe in the past decade or 15 years, since Silicon Valley became a big threat, it has mostly been industrial and media conglomerates whose business agendas were suddenly at risk from these disruptors in Silicon Valley. But that in itself is an indication who calls the shots in the European economy when it comes to questions of development, and when it comes to questions of kind of orienting the economy towards serving someone's needs. And those needs were probably, Austria maybe is a special case because of the stronger labor union tradition here and the much better organized labor. But in most other European countries, it has been the interest of capital. And traditionally, it's very hard to think strategically about technology from that perspective when you uncritically accept the global economy as is. And by and large, Europe and Europe's export industries, especially those of Germany and to some extent France, have been beneficiaries of an open economy and selling cars to whoever will buy them. And if you accept the global economy with all of its celebration of liberalization and all of its kind of celebration of no tariffs, no industrial strategy, let's just trade with everyone because that will allow us to sell more goods, you end up with no technology strategy whatsoever, because you have tied your own hands in prohibiting yourself from crafting policy instruments that would allow you to force, for example, American players, when they do come to Europe, into sharing the intellectual property with you, so you don't have to maybe take it away from them the way, for example, China is accused of doing, right? Or you can force them to share data with you. You can force them to open up, the tendering process in a way. So, I mean, none of those instruments have been used because they would also be deemed illegal by WTO and others.
How can you challenge the United States with technology? Today, I think it is today, we have a NATO summit, and Europe is willing to accept whatever the US President Donald Trump asks, because there is a total dependency, or a very high dependency. And yesterday, an article that really called my attention in the Politico was that Donald Trump can simply switch off internet for Europe. I'm not saying he's going to do it, but he can do it. So what does Europe have as a leverage to challenge this supremacy or monopolies?
I wouldn't be against switching off the internet, to be honest. I think we should explore that as an option, and maybe we'll go back to Minitel and develop it the way it should have been developed. I mean, look, I just think we have to, let me just reiterate what I said in my previous answer. We cannot live in magic land in Europe where we are selling high-value goods like cars, and we expect everyone to accept them without tariffs on whatever terms we want to sell them on, while expecting that the same kind of treatment wouldn't be unleashed on Europe itself when it comes to more sophisticated goods and services. And ultimately, if we do want in Europe to have a slightly different strategy when it comes to reorienting our economy towards AI or towards things other than cars, maybe want electric cars, maybe want more batteries, maybe want to make them cheaper in Europe, that would require a major social compromise between capital and labor, because it would require shutting down also quite a lot of factories. And we will need to do something with those people. We can't have all of that happen painlessly. So we are not going to suddenly switch from one heavily dependent sector of the economy with a lot of people employed in it to a high-tech sector in a costless, painless kind of way. So anybody who promises that, like Macron has been doing, I think they're just being disingenuous. That aside, I think the only way to challenge America on this front is to essentially through two ways. A, you have to be able to develop national or European infrastructure, which will not make you reliant on not just foreign players, but foreign players who are mostly represented by private and occasionally unhinged individuals, like Elon Musk, for example, but there was a discussion in Italy, for example, recently, earlier this year, about whether they should be switching more of government communication services to Starlink. I made a comment in an interview to Republica saying that, well, see how Starlink is governed. And it's a company that is private. It's not quoted on any stock exchange. It's majority owned by Elon Musk. He can essentially do whatever he wants. And if he decides to pick a fight with the Italian president over some completely unrelated issue like migration, which he did, or wants to intervene in the Italian judiciary process, complaining about Italian courts, as he did, he might just turn off the communications. And everybody laughed at it. But then, as he was sparring with Donald Trump, he threatened to even disconnect the American space station from Starlink, threatening, the American president with that. That's not a very robust strategy to keep delegating our strategic communications, including those of the government, to such players. And that just should not be allowed. It should be made illegal by the European Commission, and we should be fostering European players. We have some in internet satellite business. They are smaller than Musk, but in part they're smaller because they have not been funded to the same extent and they have not innovated to the same extent, partly as a result of that. So this is strategy number one. But strategy number two requires basically, again, having this very painful conversation about to what extent we want to be a center of this new booming AI economy. And seriously compete with China and seriously compete with the US. And I just don't think that it's a matter of investment, because it's not just about creating another campus, it's a matter of deciding how much of other sectors would need to be downplayed. And this is a very uncomfortable discussion, and I don't see politicians wanting to tackle it. And they keep promising us that just by having some Gulf state come in and invest another 5 or 10 billion, which is what Macron has done. Most of the money that he raised to promote AI in France, it comes from the same sources that the money that Elon Musk has raised comes from. It comes from the Gulf, or it comes from the Saudis. And I just don't think that this is necessarily a very honest answer, because again, it completely disregards all of the structural, strategic, trade and geopolitical issues that structure a country's capacity to do something with AI, not just as a consumer, but as an actual shaper, if you will, of the field.
Sometimes it seems to me, I'll just give an example, that the way Europe tries to compete is wrong. In Spain, the local Spanish government in Aragon is very happy to announce that they are allowing to build a big data center in a part of the country that is very dry, and these data centers consume a lot of energy and a lot of water. So basically the whole area will remain without water, but the project is, Amazon will build it. The project is presenting as part of the Spanish competitive strive on AI. But I have another question before I open for the audience. I have two more questions. I would like you to explain, you wrote a big essay that was translated into many languages about the philosophy of these big tech bosses, because before they were Yeah, you said they try to shape politics, now they want to implement their ideas. Peter Thiel is better known in Austria than others, but what are their philosophies? What is it which is the society they really want to promote? What would that society? I understood Peter Thiel also said his democracy may not be the best system. You wrote very long essays. Can you just briefly explain what is it that they want? Some of them have become Christian, some want to build islands offshore. Which society is convenient for them to make more money?
Sure. Well, coming back to your comment before the question, so the situation in Spain and the data centers, I think, is very interesting and should be analyzed, and it builds upon what I was saying about financialization, because you cannot really understand the boom that's currently happening in data centers without understanding that it's ultimately a real estate industry trying to find a second lease on life by converting a lot of empty spaces and trying to go and purchase warehouses that now stay empty and factories and whatnot, and convert them into data centers. And that's why big financial players from Blackstone to KKR to others are heavily implicated in this. And by and large, they have zero interest in AI other than an area of investment, but they do have a lot of interest in real estate, in which they have been active players for a very long time. So again, this points to one of the reasons why it's so hard to make sense of technology, because you really need to know how to read a balance sheet. And most people who talk about technology, unfortunately, don't have that capacity. They prefer to talk about something else. And at this point, disentangling an issue like AI or data centers from Wall Street and finance, it's very hard. So to answer your question about the ideological profile of that crowd, it's not coherent by any means. Some of them, like the CEO of Palantir, Alex Karp, would come out and present themselves as center-left, and he's someone who wrote a PhD on Adorno and Talcott Parsons, and studied with Jürgen Habermas. So they are not all card-carrying fans of Milton Friedman. They do end up endorsing a certain state-centric agenda, even when they proclaim to be libertarians, in part because they are very large beneficiaries of public money. A lot of that money comes, as I've already mentioned, from the Pentagon, but a lot of it comes from a National Health Service in the UK. So today, or yesterday, there was a big letter actually signed by doctors and medical professionals in Britain protesting against ongoing involvement of Palantir into the National Health Service in the UK, which is an ongoing issue.
Palantir, that is Peter Thiel.
Well, Palantir is a company that has been owned in part by Peter Thiel. It's a public company. It's not actually in Silicon Valley, as many of these companies now are not. They moved out. I think they're somewhere in Colorado, actually. But yes, it produced a number of very interesting people with, well, interesting, in scare quotes, with different ideological backgrounds. So, as I said, Alex Karp is a very different, on paper at least, kind of beast from someone like his other co-founder, John Lansdale, who co-founded something called the University of Austin, which is now positioning itself as the anti-woke school for people who want to really get free speech on campus, which means that they take this very anti-woke attitude.
Why has Silicon Valley become anti-woke?
Well, I discussed that in the passage that you reference. I mean, ultimately, we have to understand that there is a certain percentage, I think it's a small percentage, but it's a percentage nonetheless, among tech workers in Silicon Valley, who probably because of the nature of their trade, are extremely self-reflexive and who are reflexive about what's going on in the world, and who have not completely lost the connection, whether real or spiritual, to many of the activist movements of the 1970s that were quite active in opposing Silicon Valley's, but also MIT's involvement in the Vietnam War and in a lot of other Cold War era military campaigns. And there was a very vibrant movement of computer professionals for social responsibility, which did a lot of activism. It became more or less inactive, I would say, in the past few decades, but the conflict in the Middle East suddenly, over the past 15 years, has brought it back into spotlight, or at least those issues into spotlight. And a lot of domestic issues in the US related to racial tension and protests happening all over the country have also greatly contributed to radicalizing workers that did harbor some radical attitudes. What that resulted in are campaigns to insist on these companies pulling out from big contracts with immigration authorities, with border control, with the CIA, with the NSA, and with the Pentagon. And we're not just talking about Palantir, we're also talking about companies like Google, like Amazon, Microsoft, and so forth. So companies that are not outright militaristic, at least not like Palantir is, or Anduril, or to some extent SpaceX. So from that perspective, the anti-woke campaign of Silicon Valley was really an effort to try to clean its own ranks by creating the kind of environment where people would be afraid to speak out. So we have seen that earlier this year, for example, when a number of Palestinian activists stood up during the presentation by Mustafa Suleiman, who himself is Muslim, at Microsoft in March, or April, I believe, to insist on him needing to make some statement about the war and genocide in Palestine, they were essentially fired the day after, right? So it would have probably been unthinkable 5 or 6 years ago, which tells us something about the way in which the rallying of this industry behind Trump had allowed it to benefit from the overall radicalization of the debate and the climate and the overall zeitgeist.
Last question before opening the floor. You have a book coming out, I understand, in 2026.
Coming out for a decade, so I can safely say that it is coming out.
So what is the focus of your current research and concern?
Sure. Well, simply put, I have been trying for a long time to understand why the left, or progressive forces in general, have so little to say about technology beyond just wanting to regulate it. And traditionally, if you follow the speeches of both socialist and social democratic parties, and even communist ones in Europe, it would be, in even Latin America, it would primarily be about we need to tax these billionaires, or we need to tax these companies, or we need to make sure that they don't abuse our data. And it's all very dry regulatory paradigm. And I felt that there is really no constructive project of any kind. And sooner or later, I realized that the absence of this vision for technology that would be a little bit more creative and positive and oriented towards something other than regulation has to do with the absence of an underlying project, because ultimately that's what progressive forces want to do. At this point, they've become, to some extent, I don't want to say reactionary, but we can say reactive. They want to defend the welfare state, which is worth defending, and they want to regulate big business. What is there to do beyond that is not a question that they tackle, in part because they find some solace in embracing liberalism and just saying that we can leave people to their own devices and they will be happy. And I just don't think that either Wall Street or Silicon Valley wants to leave us to our own devices. And, and then thinking that just by leaving people alone, we will somehow ensure that they end up happy and they will find their own way to happiness. I just think it's an assumption that has not really been sufficiently tested by the liberal elements that many people on the left have embraced. So I have been thinking for a very long time what the progressive equivalent, if you will, of the market would be, and the kind of social democratic or socialist imaginary, And it occurred to me that the best equivalent of the market as this infrastructure of modernity that allows all of us as consumers and entrepreneurs to realize our deepest desires and to reinvent ourselves and to be creative and build our own apps and start our own startups. The only possible equivalent of that in our kind of other ideological reservoir is really technology, and it's the ability to deploy various technological inventions to coordinate groups inside society in such a way that something new comes out of their praxis. And that new is not captured by the venture capitalists, and it's not captured by startups, and it's not captured by entrepreneurs. And to some extent, the last 10 or 15 years have shown us the way towards it, and it has shown us also the limitation of the current model, because even with AI today, all of us, increasingly all of us, can code our own little apps. We can be extremely creative without necessarily needing to spend decades on learning and mastering code. But what can we actually do with all of that creativity if we just want to innovate for our own sake to solve the problems that society and capitalism throws in our face? We can, of course, innovate and make sure that we deploy LLMs to, I don't know, help our children solve their homework or plan a trip when the transportation is on strike, or to basically solve these little frictions, which might soon be much bigger than before as the social model crumbles. But is there something more that we can do? And I think that there is, but it requires building alternative social, legal, and cultural institutions that would allow us to valorize and act upon this creative potential that these technologies contain. But instead of forming a startup or creating an app that will collect other people's data and then we will need to sell it, to monetize it, etc., we would actually be able to tap into that immense creative potential and act out of solidarity and build institutions and build all sorts of collective projects that would not presuppose that the only way to succeed in life is by becoming an entrepreneur and having your own startup.
Well, in the name of startup, who will start asking questions? I open the floor. And please introduce yourself.
Hello, Ivo Stankov, OMV. I have a question about your theory about the so-called Silicon Valley tech oligarch intellectuals, because one aspect that I think I'm kind of figuring out and finding out is that they are untypically, at least not across the board, extremely war-friendly, to put it mildly. We have quite...
Extremely what?
Friendly, war-friendly.
War-friendly.
Yeah, kind of, okay. Let's say, neocon war-friendly or Hillary Clinton type Democrat war-friendly. I mean,
can you just ask the question?
Yes.
Because, yeah.
Yes. Do you agree? I mean, we have, of course, Mr. Karp, but we have the Peter Thiel pals from all in podcasts, like David Sachs, who is now in the White House administration, Chamath, Elon Musk himself. It's
what
not.
Is the question?
It's not. Is it? Do you agree? Because the statement was there very also focused on moving forward and profiting from wars. I'm not sure it's an across-the-board statement.
Could you please ask the question? Because we have another...
Do you agree with this? That's the question, Evgeny.
I mean, look, so, I mean, I haven't really fully explained the entirety of that article, which I would just encourage you to go and read, but this shorter version is that I was arguing that unlike traditional public intellectuals who essentially try to intervene into the public sphere with their ideas, and they try to make discursive, rational arguments and essentially try to convince us of something, perhaps manipulating us or using the platforms that they own. I mean, I wasn't idealizing it in the Habermasian sense, but the traditional public intellectuals works through the public sphere using debate as their natural traffic or currency of exchange, if you will. this newer breed of Silicon Valley oligarch intellectuals, as I call them, they do something else. They definitely have a lot of ideas about how the world should function. Many of them are very trivial. Some of them are responses to what they perceive, in my opinion, rather falsely as the entrenched hegemony of progressive classes and all of the institutions of society which they want to eliminate and so forth. But they don't seek just to dominate in some kind of cultural Gramscian sense. So in that sense, their celebration of Breitbart's saying that technology is downstream from, politics is downstream from culture, it's not correct, because often what they do is that they use their money and their investment vehicles to proliferate, not to proliferate, but to essentially promote the ideas. But not in a philanthropic way, which they do a little bit as well, but in a very concrete money-making way. So they would go and bank on anti-ESG causes, for example, but not by funding people who go around and say that having companies take sustainability seriously is a bad thing. They would actually go and make short positions through their hedge funds and investment vehicles to make sure that companies that do take strong sustainability positions suffer. And to me, it's a very different kind of intervention from the traditional, both public intellectual and the kind of normal philanthropist, financier model, where you might be making your money through those hedge funds, but then you still intervene into the public sphere philanthropically or discursively. And to me, there is something interesting there. To what extent this dynamic that I mostly focus on in the essay describes and covers their warmongering, I haven't given much thought to that. I don't think that they necessarily need to wage any cultural warfare of the kind they're waging against social causes and ESG on the warfare front, in part because they find receptive audience in the Pentagon, US government, and US public already. So there is no cultural, it doesn't really matter who is in charge. It could have been Biden and they would still be tapping, and they have, in fact, tapped into the same reservoirs of the Pentagon. They were a little bit unhappy by the fact that they were perceived increasingly as they took a pro-Trump position in the last years of Biden. They were shut off from some of the meetings at the Pentagon, and they complained about it. But by and large, they had friendly reception inside. So I don't think that that kind of cultural warfare that I've been describing as one of the key dynamics of this new oligarch intellectual figure, I don't think it's, I don't think warfare illustrates and captures it.
Thank you. There was a question in the back.
My name is Hans-Christoph Böhnger. I'm a journalist. I have a question about this. You talk about
If you get up, it may be easier to hear you. If you get up, if you
yeah, sure.
Yeah. Thank you.
You talked about how AI can sort of empower us with dealing with sort of this everyday frictions. My question would be, like, long term, what would be the vision, the perhaps leftist vision of AI that isn't this sort of capitalist empowering vision of, oh, we can replace every worker, basically all human labor will be sort of replaced by AI or other automation in the end? Like, what is an alternative, like, long-term vision to that?
Sure. Well, I think this is where, to some extent, many progressive forces and parties need to go back to the drawing board and start asking questions: what kind of subjectivity and what kind of human, if you will, they would want to see as the result of their utopian project, and what kind of institutions need to be in place for that utopian human subjectivity and potential to emerge. I know where I stand, and where I stand is that I believe that the task of this progressive project is to remove any kind of barriers, whether they are barriers of class, identity, tradition, culture, technology, or something else, that stand in the way of all of us realizing our full potential and going and pushing far beyond that. And that can be potential defined in very broad terms. It can be potential that has to do with artistic appreciation. It can be potential that has to do with intellectual ability. It can be potential that has to do with some kind of physical performance in a sport competition. But ultimately, for me, this is the goal of the progressive project, whether you call it socialism, communism, or something else. This is what the project for me should be about. It's about allowing humans to reach and go and exceed the potential that they think is somewhere out there on the horizon. From that vantage point, it's obvious that you can only get there if you surround us with the right institutions and infrastructures, of which technology should clearly be one. Because rightly configured, it can be a great tool of reflexivity, of thinking about the world, of thinking about our connections to others, of cultivating moral, intellectual, aesthetic, and other types of sensibility. That has not been the function of technology under late modern capitalism, in part because its users have been oriented towards capturing value, making things more efficient, and by and large, dispensing with the worker as an extra cost on the balance sheet. I have no problem with dispensing with the worker as an extra cost on the balance sheet if there is an alternative socioeconomic model in place that will allow us to redistribute the gains while channeling our time and capacities into cultivating the rest of our sensibilities that remain undeveloped and underdeveloped, and will probably be if we spend so much time in the workplace to begin with. Right? So in that sense, I don't think that we can turn every workplace into a fun factory the way like Marcuse was imagining in 1970s. I mean, some of work will be work, and it's fine. We will not develop the greatest sensibility or artistic appreciation we would develop in a museum, and we can accept that, but it doesn't mean that we should not be striving towards building more institutions and infrastructures and collectives that will help us somehow foster what traditional industrial and now financialized capitalism has suppressed. And from that perspective, I don't really care about calling it AI or something else, but giving us access to infrastructures for experimentation. You can just change one word, and instead of artificial intelligence, talk about experimental intelligence, and it becomes a very different paradigm, and suddenly you are activating the human subject in front of it, as opposed to finding ways to get rid of them. And that's the part that I fear most of the progressives have completely missed, because they have lost sight of what even early Marx was trying to accomplish. And it was not about building a more rational economy. It was about giving us, the human subjects, the ability to reflect and engage with each other in a way that would probably maximize the sense of fulfillment and solidarity in a way that would not destruct the conditions of possibility that make life possible in the first place. So anyhow, I can go on.
Any other questions? They don't have to be philosophical.
But we strongly prefer.
Any other? Yes, please go ahead. There's the microphone.
Oh, thank you. My name is Leonard Bernardo, and I live in downtown Brooklyn. I'd like to ask Evgeny a couple of things. First, if you could cite where that piece that Mirjana mentioned was first published, that would be fantastic. And secondly, Evgeny, I'm just wondering whether there have been any clearly market-driven examples over the last decade, whether they might be an Airbnb or an Uber, any other form of the shared economy, something that Michael Sandel would probably get titillated around. Can you find any example like these that you feel were certainly corroded and corrupted over time, but that could have had a different future? A future somewhat along the lines of the aspirational one that you lay out here.
Sure. Well, the piece was published in a publication called The Ideas Letter, which this gentleman who asked the question happens to curate. But otherwise, you should definitely subscribe to it. It's I think I have another piece coming up there, so I will just give you a little teaser. But it's a wonderful heterodox and contrarian resource that is new, but extremely interesting and intellectually ambitious. So with regards to the question of the market dynamics corroding the nature of the good, in question. I mean, I don't really have that fascination that Michael Sandel has and many others have of analyzing markets as a corroding force, because I don't think that the problem with capitalism is markets, as a good Marxist should. In part because markets predate capitalism, and they have existed and will exist after capital and capitalism are gone. So in that sense, that's not part and parcel of my concern. But we can obviously find ways throughout the last 30 or 40 years of technological and digital economy where all sorts of initially subversive movements, including most famously the free software movement, got hijacked by venture capitalists and others and were rebranded as something else. So instead of free software, which was an extremely radical project, we ended up with open source, which became much more business friendly, and it became something that you could essentially integrate into existing business models and purchase as a service, to the point where Microsoft now is one of the main players in the field, and the entire field of free software was conceived as a way to attack Microsoft. So there are ways in which all of these projects get recuperated, at least deactivated and embraced, but we'll find many others. There are, of course, pushbacks too, so I don't want to make it sound one-dimensional. We have seen, for example, in the most famous case probably, the entire movement of platform cooperativism being, to some extent, a pushback against the co-option of the sharing economy by big capital. So the problem there really was not Uber. Without major injection of cash from SoftBank and the Saudis and even Qatar, Uber wouldn't be able to survive for 10 years or 15 years it took it to make its first profit, right? And in that sense, the platform cooperativist movement, which I don't think is the right response to the accumulation of capital in the Gulf states, and but I mean, they managed to articulate some response, right? Of course, I don't think it's the right response, because the problem is not the market. In this case, it's the ability of capital to move into any area, disregard barriers, and essentially operate at scale and offer the same service in Bogota and in Bombay, right? Mumbai, it doesn't really matter, right? And it's not a factor of markets, it's a matter of somebody with deep pockets wanting to sustain those losses long enough until all the competition dies out. And now, by the way, Elon Musk just launched a service where they're charging $4.20 for a Tesla automated taxi ride. Obviously, that's not the real cost of the taxi ride, but Elon Musk can take the hit and probably rather lose money with that than by tweeting.
Just a follow-up, do any of these platforms or apps that we use, whether it is Bolt or Uber or Airbnb or Booking, who makes money? Or when do they start making money? Or it's all about injection of capital from the Saudis and the Gulf states?
Well, I mean, you got it right. It's mostly the Saudis who make the money. But ultimately, I mean, look, it's not a very complicated business model. By the way, I'm also one of those heterodox Marxists who don't think that monopoly capitalism is a problem, because I don't think that monopolies, by and large, the way many Marxists imagine them, are insurmountable problems to actors with a lot of capital. And we have seen that. You can be talking about monopoly capitalism all you want, but to somebody who can come and drop 100 billion to develop a competing AI service, it's not an issue. So Elon Musk went and raised, I don't know, $50 billion, and suddenly within 6 months, he's one of the top 5 players in AI. Not all of us can be Elon Musk, and not all of us can raise 50 billion. But once you have 50 billion, a lot of what seemed like insurmountable problems suddenly are much easier to overcome. And we have seen that in many other cases. Now, you know, you have Mark Zuckerberg going around trying to hire away people from the likes of OpenAI to work on his own AI, and he offers them 100 million a year in compensation package to software developers. It's quite a lot of money, But he can afford that, and he knows what the payoffs are, and he knows that ultimately that's how you try to move ahead or try to catch up with the competition. So in that sense, I think we should not necessarily seek refuge in proclaiming that all these firms are monopolists, because in many cases they do compete with each other. But the problem with capitalism, again, looking at Marx, it's not the fact that it gives rise to monopolists, it's just that the whole playing field is extremely irrational, and it results in a lot of unnecessary waste and a lot of unnecessary processes that shouldn't be there, like we see now with these companies blowing tens and hundreds of billions on AI in a completely unsustainable manner.
Thank you. Go ahead. Both. 1, 2, 3, 4. So first here, Judy.
Thank you, Judith Knieper. You suggested somehow a shift in terminology from AI to experimental intelligence. Yeah. Would you still call it intelligence, or should so that would be the first question. Mm-hmm. The second question, if you were a politician with full-fledged powers, what would be the steps you would undertake to reach your vision?
Sure.
Thank you.
I mean, look, whether we call it...
Okay, you also have a
Sure.
question?
Should we?
Please
let's
go
take
ahead.
more. Sure.
Yes, but I would like to give time to Mr. Morozov to answer that question.
I'm happy to take both, but thank you. Well, I mean, look, I have written another essay last year where I introduced a slightly even more confusing term than experimental. I was talking about ecological intelligence, but my idea was introducing that term was again to point out that ultimately the way Silicon Valley today conceptualizes intelligence, it's by and large the product of, it's the hidden legacy of the Cold War, where intelligence and the entire AI agenda was driven by two actors, the Pentagon and the kind of bureaucratic corporation that wanted to optimize its own processes. And we are living in that world still, even though the methods of how this intelligence is achieved have drastically changed from symbolic AI to large language models. But the point of me foregrounding ecological intelligence is to show that, again, within my political project, the primary entry point is the human subject that has to somehow navigate the world. And if that's your entry point, then it's obvious that to speak about intelligence as the property of the technological system while neglecting the human subject that is somehow thrown into that world, it's pointless and it's not very helpful. So when I would be using terms like experimental intelligence or ecological intelligence, to me, it's by default hybrid. It involves both of them, with the most important part of the equation being the human subject, because ultimately it's their development that I'm preoccupied with. Because I'm not an investor, I'm not interested in building a technology that will then be taken up and become a commodity and used by others. I mean, if you are an investor and if you are interested in commodifying just one part of it, it makes sense for you to talk about artificial intelligence, but then you have to see it as a political project and not just as a technological one. In terms of what the political measures would be, again, I think maybe after these interventions, I have maybe said enough to assure you that in my understanding of technology, and sorry for sounding banal, but it's ultimately politics by other means. And if that's true, then you cannot be regulating it without simultaneously conceiving of some alternative project of what it is you want to put in place. Because, and this is where I think Europe, because of its history and because of various historical trajectories, it sought refuge in privacy and data protection, which are all excellent, and we should not definitely weaken those laws. But in themselves, they offer, as they have been interpreted and implemented in the past decades, they do not offer sufficient nurturing capacity to bring forward this kind of development and capabilities enhancement that I want to see as a result of political process. So to continue insisting that we need to make sure that these companies do not abuse the data that they're collecting without also saying something about trade, development, industrial strategy, how we want to reconcile the fact that, you know, we are still a very much car-dependent European economy. Like, all of these questions need to be brought to the fore before we can be doing anything of substance on technology. So I would be giving you a very demagogic answer if I would tell you that the first thing to do should be to ban Palantir, because you ban Palantir and then you realize that, well, Austria, again, might be a slightly different case, but we have been privatizing healthcare and we have been privatizing the welfare state for the last 35 years. And when you privatize it, you do need some actors to come and pick up all of the outsourcing jobs, all of the privatized jobs. And if it will not be Palantir, it will be someone else. It will be the European equivalent of Palantir. And to truly reverse those processes, you need to put something else in place. You should either be doubling down on defending the welfare state and then saying we need to build a strong public capacity to tackle all of that, or you should be reinventing a completely different horizontal, decentralized agenda, relying on cooperatives and whatnot. But that is not happening. So for me, a lot of this opposition to big tech, what has been known as techlash, you know, in the last 10 or 15 years, it was an extremely demagogic populist project embraced by a lot of politicians who found a way to attack big tech and sound radical, but without necessarily having to question the premises of the overall neoliberal project that Europe has been undergoing in the last 3 decades.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Florian Raunig. I'm an Austrian diplomat. Is AI undermining one of the, let's say, traditional pillars of innovation, which is intellectual property?
Thank you. I'll take two or three questions because,
Please,
go ahead. And then there is one in the back.
Thank you. Grauenberg Institute of the Danube region, Central Europe. I just wonder, for instance, Silicon Valley mentioned frequently, a lot of the experts working there are not from the United States. So I just wonder, how do the tech people see the Trump government with limiting access of students from abroad to US universities and other institutions? I mean, the US was profiting always from an open society, but now it seems to be less and less. And how do tech people see that? Or they don't mind? Thank you.
And there was one in the back, the third one.
Hello, Eric Manson. I'm wondering about the different aspects that you talked about the tech bros and how they're trying to get the monopolies and use the unlimited capital from the Gulf states and such. China. I mean, what is the effect of China going to be in basically with their state-controlled economy doing the same thing except for twice, 3 times as hard?
Sure.
Thank you.
All right. So on intellectual property, again, it's an ambiguous question, in part because Silicon Valley, being one of the most powerful sectors of the economy and having a lot of money to burn and having the best lawyers that they can afford, they basically disregarded intellectual property laws when training most of the LLMs that currently power many of our services. So OpenAI did that with ChatGPT, Facebook did it with Llama, and others have done it as well. The extent to which, and here again, we have to look at with some nuance, because by and large, what has happened is that they have used a lot of books and writings and cultural artifacts to train the models, which is a form of infringement. But again, the courts are now having a lot of back and forth to how really infringing it is. From the perspective of authors, of course, that has been not a very pleasant blow. I wouldn't necessarily argue that we should prohibit anyone wanting to build LLMs from tapping into the global knowledge pool, but obviously there needs to be, if we were to continue with the current model, there has to be some form of paying back compensation to at least some of the actors involved. What I fear would happen if we were to go down that path that I have just outlined with starting this compensation scheme is that we will end up with a Silicon Valley administered universal basic income of some kind, which is what Sam Altman has been advocating for a very long time, where they would get their Saudi beneficiaries to essentially pay all of us a small sum of money and to perhaps continue paying it in exchange for something else. It could be biometric data, which is what another startup of Sam Altman is doing by taking our iris data and essentially paying us a little fee for that. So I'm a bit skeptical about, not skeptical, but cautious and fearful about some of the models that have been proposed to deal with that. I would be probably blind not to notice how much innovation has been unleashed by the eruption of LLMs in the last 3 years. Some of it coming from, again, where I stand politically, in a way that has, in fact, made the world more equal, which capitalism does every now and then. So again, we have to be quite nuanced when we say that. So now, for example, if you look at people who previously, again, it's all very political, so I don't want to impose my views and interpretations of reality on all of you, but I, for example, think that the way intellectual property works in software, it's not particularly beneficial to the global south. And it's the same in pharmaceuticals. So I don't think that current IP regime was written with the interests of global south in mind. The idea that now a kid in India, instead of paying $50 or using a cracked pirated version and maybe paying 10 to install some Microsoft product on their computer, can actually turn to an LLM and for free code their own little Python application that will essentially do the same and not pay anything to Bill Gates, I'm kind of quietly celebrating that. Whether these little anecdotes adapt to a more equal global economy, I much doubt that. But I would still leave the door open for some analysis, because I don't think that the picture is necessarily black and white in terms of who's gaining and who's losing. In terms of the question of Silicon Valley and foreign talent, I think that your Austrian ex-chancellor is safe. He will not be deported from Peter Thiel's company anytime soon. But beyond that, I mean, look, Silicon Valley has went extremely quiet on this. Most of their concerns have been about H-1B visas. It has not been about students or about people doing gardening or whatever else these poor immigrants that they're now deporting are doing. So in that sense, there has been some initial squabbling over H-1B visas at the beginning. I think that the Silicon Valley kind of prevailed on that. Trump went quiet on high talent visas and has focused where it truly matters, and they will not be sending, or maybe they will, I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen those type of people sent to El Salvador yet, but maybe they will start sooner or later. But right now they're going after a slightly different pool, and for that reason, Silicon Valley has kind of disengaged, I think, from that discussion and has not made as many noises as they did in the first Trump administration, where Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, would be showing up at the airport to protest against some of the initial rulings and the ban on Muslim countries that Trump implemented at some point early in his first administration. The question about China, it's very interesting. I mean, they have chosen a very different model for AI development than the US. I think they have actually, if you analyze the laws for regulating LLMs, they have been early pioneers, I would say, in that field. It has not hurt innovation in China. So the usual talking points that we hear from Silicon Valley that imposing more regulation on technology companies will result in slower innovation, they have not really worked in China. They're still pushing above their weight, so to say. They have also managed to leverage the benefits of forcing their companies to share the IP with each other. So a lot of what they do is in the form of open source. And by being able to tap into innovations made by other companies, the other Chinese companies have essentially managed to stay competitive with the US, which was a very different approach from what America itself did, where there is extreme secrecy and constant battles over IP and patents. So obviously, most of those laws that have been passed have been written with not just with commercial trade and economic development in mind, but was also with the need to, in one way or another, control and shape the circulation of opinions and prevent all sorts of protests that might happen. We know that too. That's not news. I do think that we are likely to see repetition of what we saw with Facebook being used to essentially facilitate a genocide in Myanmar, but with artificial intelligence, generative intelligence, and generative AI, it's just a matter of time. So strict regulation of these companies and how this information spreads would not necessarily be a bad thing. So again, maybe there is something to learn from China. Maybe we should not, of course, go the full way, but I just don't think that the kind of discussions that are now happening in the US, where they want to ban every single American state from regulating AI companies for a decade, I don't think they're very healthy. It seems kind of insane to essentially prevent anyone from imposing any regulation on these companies for a decade. That's extreme, but that's where we are. That's the new reality of America.
We have passed the hour. I can give one last question. There is no, well, it's hot, so there is wine outside, there are snacks. Shall we start thinking about better society and more solidary society with Evgeny outside and give him a huge applause?
Thank you.